Hello, this is Joe Nimzora, and I'll flash it on me for just a second. This is my teaching demonstration via YouTube for the job at Castleton State College in Castleton, Vermont. Kim, I'd love to have you share this with the whole committee. And I'd like to express my thanks to the committee for the interview we had and all that kind of stuff. It was actually quite fun to talk with them. And I thought I learned a lot of interesting things about your organization by doing this. Here's what happens. I am capable of lecturing on a variety of things, and yes, I can do PowerPoint and stand behind a podium in one place and regurgitate or expositate thought, but my favorite things nowadays are a little bit fuzzier and require a little different order of magnitude of thinking in terms of critical thinking. A lot of times I talk about health policy and that sort of thing. Because I'm a past president of the State Nurses Association in the Great Pine Tree State of Maine, a lot of times I talk with people about legislative issues. And when I've taught the issues and trends class for seniors at UH in the past, what I've done has been to kind of do this following lecture on the subject of the definition of nursing and the Nurse Practice Act. And it's pretty much a canned lecture in as much as I know what I'm going to say because I do this all the time. Even when I've not taught the issues and trends class, I've been a guest lecturer in that subject. So what I'm going to do is kind of deliver at least the first part of it, and here we go. I have a piece of paper in front of me in lieu of a blackboard, and what I want the students to do is to draw 3 overlapping circles like this. Part of this comes from Linda Jewell Carpenito, who talked about the bifocal model of nursing, and used a lot in associate degree education, but it makes a lot of sense to talk about the difference between medicine and nursing. And the idea here is that in any given state Nurse Practice Act, there are 3 definitions of what a nurse does. Sometimes they're more explicit, sometimes they're less. But the first one is to talk about what nurses do. Now, one of the things that I always ask the students is, when you're a registered nurse, who are you registered with, and why are you registered? And usually we stop and take questions from the audience. And often they don't know that they're registered with the state. And then I point out that the state also registers sex offenders, which usually gets a laugh. But the idea here is, why are you registered? And one of the reasons is because the state can regulate your activities, and the state has to be able to find you at all times in case there's a complaint about you from a member of the public. And so the registration actually has many legal ramifications that are defined by the state. Another question I always ask, and I failed to look this up for the state of Vermont, but I ask, when was the State Nurse Practice Act formed, and when did the state legislature create the category of registered nursing? And I have people write it on a piece of paper, show it to the person next to you, and then they guess. I've sometimes heard people say, 1970, 1959, or whatever. So then the next question after that is, it's usually, and I bet you in the state of Vermont, it's probably about 1915 to 1916. So then the third question I ask to get people going on that same subject is, what year did women get the right to vote in the United States? And the answer is 1921. Now, when they put together the idea of what the Registered Nurse Practice Act was, and the idea that in order to form the category of registered nursing, an all-female profession, it had to be voted on by an all-male legislature state by state. Just contemplate the magnitude of the work that had to have done in order to take place, and what it meant to be able to create that, because At the time that it was happening, that Nurse Practice Acts were created, it was prior to the invention of penicillin, it was prior to the invention of modern anesthesia, it was prior to the invention of everything. And there had to be a compelling reason for the state legislatures to decide that this was worthwhile. What I always tell the students is, and they need to write this down, is that whenever you're attempting to convince the legislature to do anything, if you're attempting to convince them on the basis of whether it will benefit nurses, the legislature will always tell you to go to the back of the line with the policemen, the firefighters, the teachers, other government workers of all kinds, etc., and wait for your handout. If you go to the legislature and the idea is that you're never doing anything for the profession of nursing, but you're always doing it to advance the health of the men, women, and children of whatever state you happen to be in, the general response of the legislature is, come over here and sit down and tell me what we need to do. So that, although we want nurses to ultimately become powerful, they become powerful paradoxically by saying that they're not doing it for themselves but for the patients they serve, which is actually true. And as long as people remember that, that has a very potent effect on what's going to happen. So anyway, so we get the preliminaries over, and there's one other preliminary question. How many registered nurses are there in the state of Vermont? Now here's one I haven't looked up either, but I'm willing to guess it's probably about the same as Maine or New Hampshire, just because of or Hawaii for that matter, just because of the population. It's probably around 12,000 active nurses, but many times people are joining a profession and they don't even know how many people are already in the profession ahead of them. So that's what we talk about. Nursing has three parts, and some of them are independent. Those are the parts in the circle, and some of them are collaborative or interdependent. And so the first part is actually to define what nursing is. And nursing is two things. The first thing is the use of nursing diagnosis, which means biopsychosocial wellness, teaching, promotion of health, all that kind of stuff. And the next thing is nursing is the nursing process, which is assessment, planning, intervention, and evaluation. So that's the heart and soul of nursing, and if I were teaching this at Castleton State, I would read the definition out of the Vermont State Practice Act. Some state practice acts are much more clear about use of diagnosis and nursing process, and they use those terms. Others do not. And that has ramifications depending on which state you're in. One of the things that nurses need to always deal with, which they've sort of subliminally been dealing with since the beginning of school, has been the idea of what's the relation between nursing and medicine. And so that means in order to be a nurse, we do have to understand the definition of medicine. And medicine encompasses MDs, DOs, and certain kinds of dentists. But the definition of medicine is first to diagnose illness and to prescribe medicines, and thirdly to perform surgery. Medicine also does things like pronouncing death. Oh, my handwriting's bad today. Pronouncing death, and according to Medicare, the medicine is gatekeeper for authorization of medical services, but that's not often written in the state-by-state Nurse Practice Act. So that to diagnose an illness, to treat it using therapy, I should say treatment or RX, medications, prescribing medications, or surgery, performing surgery, is medical practice. This area right in here, in this in-between area, is the area of overlap, which is referred to as by Carpenito and others as the collaborative practice of medicine. That means certain repetitive tasks that the doctor feels are safe to delegate to nurses that can be conducted by nurses. And that's where we start getting into the idea of delegation, which is actually kind of a hot button issue for probably the last 15 years now. If it's a hot button issue for 15 years, is it really a hot button issue? But the idea here is, when does a nurse carry out a medical plan and how do they do it? And what is the highly specific definition of how that takes place? It has very interesting ramifications, and that's at the heart of a lot of nursing practice. So the question that I have for the students at this time, raise your hands, folks, is, are nurses supposed to carry out doctor's orders? If a nurse gets a set of orders from the doctor, does the nurse carry them out? And invariably you have people in the class who say, well, yeah, that's what nurses do. Nurses are there for that. Well, by the time they're seniors, they should be a little more clever than that, and they should have figured that out, it's got a little more nuance to it. And actually, the responsibility of the nurse is to decide whether to accept the delegation of the physician or not. And that's critical in terms of regulations and policies and procedures governing nursing, because the nurse does have their independent judgment. It's been shown in case law over and over again that if the nurse believes that the physician has made an error, it's the nurse's duty not to commit the error by following the orders blindly, but to question those orders. And that's the difference between orders and delegation on the part of nurses and doctors. Nurses are not actually there to take doctors' orders. They're just there to accept delegation or not. And they have their own liability to protect as they do. What happens is, if the nurse is unable to accept the delegation, it becomes very important that they communicate back to the physician as to the reasons why, in such a manner that if ultimately those orders are correct, they can be carried out without harm to the patient, possibly by the physician or by someone else who's more qualified. But this means the nurse has to be very articulate about what they accept or don't accept in terms of orders and what the rationale is. So the idea here is nurses do have to know a fair amount of medical practice beyond simply nursing diagnosis and APIE in order to carry out that collaborative function. As Carpenito said, sometimes there is an overlap. If you're assisting a surgeon at surgery, the overlap area between the two is much closer, just because of the nature of the work. You're standing right there. Now, that's kind of the brief summary about the relationship between nursing and medicine. I always think this set of diagrams, a Venn diagram, looks like the Olympic rings. Spare me from singing you the Olympic theme song. There's this other circle that we haven't even really talked about, and this becomes very important in other ways. And one of the other ways is nurses also delegate some things about nursing to personnel themselves. And generally speaking, the personnel that they would be delegating to are unlicensed assistive personnel or CNAs, or something like that, a person in that kind of job category. And unlicensed assistive personnel and CNAs also have things that they do that are not really delegated by the nurse necessarily in the subject of hotel services, I guess you would call it. But the reason that I deliver this lecture and all is because in the last, I think it was 1998 at this point, but I'm trying to remember, the National Council of State Boards decided that they would reweight the NCLEX exam to be paying much more attention to the legal aspects of nurse delegation and leading a team that includes unlicensed assistive personnel and the legal ins and outs. This was during a time when people were cutting back RN staffing, which certainly hasn't been brought back, but in the meantime, what was happening was there was feedback to the National Council of State Boards that many graduate nurses were not prepared in this area. And in fact, usually when I've taught the issues and trends class at some time other than this particular lecture, I've actually brought in the complete set of overheads and materials from National Council of State Boards to go over in detail the definition of successful delegation or lack thereof, and the red flags and the delegation pyramid and all that stuff, for the idea of looking at knowing exactly how you go about it and also developing the communication skills to accompany this. Now, as an aside, if Castleton does not own the National Council of State Boards materials, run, don't walk, to the web where you can order them and have them available to you. And as a matter of fact, I think it's about a 50-page PDF on the subject, which actually draws heavily on the materials of Ruth Hanston of Washington State, who was an AONE consultant to that organization on this subject. And the idea being that an understanding of the legal definition of nursing is not complete until you have also looked at how you exist in the hierarchical structure of overlapping scopes of practice from different disciplines within healthcare. So the idea here is that there is the delegation process actually between nurses and UAPs is a two-way street, and that if a UAP fails to delegate, action can be taken against them, but if a RN fails to delegate properly, action can be taken against the RN's license. And so the RN is much more accountable to the profession as a whole and to the licensing board than to a UAP. I really don't have the time to go into detail with the delegation lecture, and frankly, when I use it, I pretty much go right by the cookbook from the National Council of State Boards. I figure if the National Council of State Boards publishes it and we're teaching it to seniors who want to do well on the NCLEX exam, let's start using their framework so that it's a reasonable assumption to guess that delegation questions that come up on the NCLEX will be based on the material given by the National Council of State Boards, since after all they publish the test blueprint and their materials are in support of that. But anyway, having said that, one of the things that I often do here is to actually draw the distinction between criminal, civil, and regulatory proceedings against a nurse, and just talk about how the difference between who prosecutes, whether you have a jury or not, what a jury of your peers constitutes, and that sort of thing. But the idea here is to set the tone for identifying all issues and trends in nursing as they are impacted by or give impact to the definition of nursing in the Nurse Practice Act within any given state. And it has to always start with what the Nurse Practice Act says and go from there. So usually when I've taught the semester-long course, we start there. And each time that we meet and we discuss this, we actually also go over, and we're talking about any issue, we try to look at it in this light. So this is an overarching issue of legal accountability for nursing that really forms a theme for all other issues in nursing, issues and trends. Well, it's just about 20 minutes. I think that was plenty to bite off and chew. Normally this particular lecture is 50 minutes long, so I have a bunch of stuff that I didn't cover that's related to this. I like to have the students draw, and I'm old-fashioned enough to remember having taught with chalk in the beginning. And as I say, I can use a variety of teaching methods, but this is one. And it's been a pleasure doing this for you. Thank you very much. Bye.